Our guests have arrived and I'm almost ready to begin. In a moment, Ashraf will introduce you to our panel, all of whom will be contributing to our discussion topic this time round of gender-based abuse and violence at the workplace. This series is produced by Sharon McKinnon and directed for television by Ray Wilson. Workers' World starts now.
From England to Poland, every step across the ocean, the ruling classes them is in a mess. Oh yes, the capitalist system a regress, but the Soviet system now progress. So which one of them you think is best? When are the two of them the workers are content?
And now, to introduce this week's program is Ashraf Ratcliffe.
Welcome to our weekly labour show here on Cape Town TV. Our subject is gender-based abuse and violence at the workplace. What are trade unions doing about that? Violence and abuse against women is all pervasive in South Africa. However, this social evil is not confined to the domestic sphere and causes suffering for women and for women workers. It means working in extremely oppressive workplaces. It is estimated that more than half of all working women internationally experience sexual assault, harassment and abuse by their male counterparts at the workplace. In today's show, we discuss the problem and, more importantly, what is being done about it. As an example of this social crisis, we assess the case of Pinky Mosiani, a young female mine worker who was allegedly raped and murdered while on shift underground. Despite clear evidence, no arrests have been made, no charges have been laid, and after 18 months, there is still no case appearing in court. With us to discuss this very serious issue on today's show, we have David van Wyk, lead researcher at Benchmark Foundation. Welcome, David.
Good evening.
Our second guest is Sisonke Msimang, senior program specialist at Sonke Gender Justice. Welcome, Sisonke.
Thank you very much.
And our third guest is Lauren Upping from the Federation of Unions of South Africa, FEDUSA. Welcome, Lauren.
Good evening.
We look forward to your views on this very important topic. But first, we look and watch the short video on the subject put together by the Workers' World Media Productions editorial team.
My sister was killed last year, I think around February the 6th, in one of Anglo-American platinum mines, which is Komanani Shaft, where I'm currently working.
The case was reported to us by the mine management, and we then had to intervene by going to see what was happening in the mine, and it was then confirmed that there was a dead body of a woman who was lying in the pool of blood in underground in one of the shafts, and there were then elements of rape and there were elements of assault. The cause of death was as a result of the hard object or a rock or a steel that was used to take the life of the mine worker who was underground, and then there were then those other elements of bruises or assault on the body and that element of rape. But the big one is the one where a hard object was used to hit the lady on the head.
I miss her so much. Even every time when I look at her daughter, it's very difficult for me to like she brings her memories. Because even my mom, I sometimes even tell my mom if she wanna tell me about how her daughter, like at night she would just scream and all those things, and I told her like I really don't like this conversation about because it makes me it brings the pain in my heart, like the memory, her memories. I'm trying all my means to forget and like deal with the fact that like she's gone, but it's very difficult for me.
Trade unions need to have far stronger gender officers in the mining areas of the country. And I think that each mine, perhaps on its human resource management team, should have a gender desk which specifically focuses on the condition of women workers in the mine, until you get a situation where the working environment has been changed adequately to accommodate women. I also think that they need to provide change rooms for women as a requirement, and they need to make provision for women in terms of the kinds of work that women are doing in the mines, to ensure that women are not put into compromised positions in the mines.
And the mining conditions of women working underground in terms of the mine health and safety are in a good standard. Pinky was a belt operator. And then as a belt operator, you are like stations. Each and every one is having her own station whereby you are working alone in that. And some of the female comrades has been raising that to management to say they don't feel comfortable, especially those who were employed lately, to say, if I may put it in this way, possibly if I may get sick or I may get dizzy, then maybe something falls on top of me or something happened. Possibly the chances of me getting help are like mean. That was the issue. We were busy with the management in ensuring that all the belt operators who are working one-on-one, company must do something that no one must find herself working alone in a workplace.
We're doing our best, not on this case, but on the many other cases that we are investigating. But as we are doing our best, we also wish that our public will understand that the merits of our cases are not the same. And as they differ, some of the cases would take longer to investigate, and some of the cases would have quick wins in terms of ensuring that the perpetrators of that crime are brought to book with speed. Now, on this case, I can assure the public that our investigation is currently on, and as soon as some findings are there, and I can assure you that there will be a breakthrough, and when there's a breakthrough, I think it would be a time that we can then say to the family, it is time to close. But just give us time, allow the police to do their work, allow the detectives to do their work.
I would really love to see whoever killed my sister, he or she must be arrested, because it really hurts me to see when I'm watching the news, as I can see the perpetrators of other people being arrested. Like my dream is that I really want to see justice being done. I really want to see the person who killed my sister.
Let's go to our panel with our questions. Sisonke, how widespread is the problem of abuse and violence against women at the workplace?
It's fairly extensive. In South Africa, about 77% of working women report ever having been sexually harassed. But I think what's important is to recognize that our society in general is very violent, particularly towards women. So if you look at the statistics, then we know that about 25% of women report ever having been a victim of some form of gender-based violence. Then we've got the 77% statistic I just quoted you for the workplace. And then we've got very high levels of street-based violence against women. So if you imagine what it feels like then to be a woman in South Africa, you've got violence in the home, you've got your walk or your taxi ride to work being an extremely violent experience, and then you've subjected to violence often in the workplace as well.
Quite a serious problem. I mean, what is Vedusa's view of this sort of violence, Lauren?
Yeah, I mean, it's unacceptable in our society in general, but I mean, in the workplace, we find that a lot of women are very vulnerable in their workplaces. Women are generally not as economically empowered as men, which means they often find themselves in vulnerable work, such as domestic work or casual labor, where the work is precarious, things like security sector or the agricultural sector. Even in the retail and hospitality sectors, you find that women work on contracts or they're working shift labor. And in those environments, you find that women are more vulnerable to sexual harassment because they want to keep their jobs. And so bringing these types of abuses to the fore means that they might run the risk of losing their jobs.
A quick follow-up, Lauren. What has FEDUSA done about the situation that women face in the workplace?
Well, I mean, FEDUSA, obviously, as an overarching federation, has a very different role on one hand to unions working on the ground. And that is looking at intervening in terms of policy and legislation in the country. But we do work alongside our unions to try and empower them to make interventions in the workplace. And a lot of the work we do is around educating women in the workplace or shop stewards on their rights around sexual harassment and abuse, around domestic violence, around really giving them the power to make use of that legislation and the policies and procedures that should be in place. And also empowering the negotiators to bring these issues into the collective bargaining agenda.
Thanks, David. My sense is that Benchmark Foundation, and being the lead researcher there, you've done quite a bit of work in the mining sector. I mean, could you give us a sense how widespread this problem of abuse and violence against women in the workplace is in the mining sector?
Well, we've done two studies, one in 2007 and then one again in 2012, looking at conditions of mine workers and communities living in and around mines. And we find that mining has impacted on the lives of women on the platinum belt particularly quite badly. Well, first of all, when a new mine comes into an area, it dispossesses people of the land, and there's a special relationship between woman and land. And suddenly women no longer have any way of putting food on the table, and very often they find themselves becoming sex workers in communities where there are lots of migrant workers and so on. Then the government and the mining industry established the mining charter, and according to the mining charter, initially in the first 5 years, 10% of all mine workers had to be women, and then later that was increased to 13%. But nothing was changed to change the culture of the workplace in mining, and as a consequence, the women who go down our mines suffer terribly. Apart from sexual harassment, there's also extensive sexual transactions and so on that take place underground, and all the union shop stewards and so on that we've spoken to, as well as personnel managers at mines and so on, indicate that the problem is absolutely huge. In fact, we spoke to Anglo Platinum maybe 4 weeks before Pinky was murdered in one of their mines, in fact, and the personnel manager told us that the situation was absolutely horrific.
Well, thanks for that. Could I follow up quickly on that, David, and ask you, we know that many trade unions have several policies and resolutions about ensuring equality and protection for women at the workplace. But what have trade unions like COSATU, because my sense is you've been meeting mainly with the COSATU and other perhaps unions in the mining sector. What has been done about the situation of women to ensure that they are not abused?
Well, I think that COSATU and so on have got gender programs that relate to workers in the workplace and so on. But the thing with South Africa and industry in South Africa is that we've got to move beyond formal programs. We actually have to begin to demand a restructuring of the workplace to make the workplace a friendly place for women, and where women can come without fear of being harassed or abused sexually.
If I could get on that question to you, Sisonke, I mean, your experience in working with trade unions and workers around the issue of gender-based violence, I mean, what is your sense are the unions and the federations doing?
I can't speak as much about the unions, but let me say that the work that Sonke Gender Justice does focuses specifically on men and boys. So our core focus has always been to recognize that if you're going to change gender relations in this country, you need to focus on men and boys as much as you focus on women and girls. So if you only focus on women, then what you get is a strengthening of their voice. You get women who are empowered and know their rights. But what we often see, and a big root cause of violence in South Africa, is backlash. Because frankly, when you bring in policies and you bring in changes to the law and you say that women and men are equal and you haven't had a commensurate societal and culture shift to the very issues that David is raising, then what you end up getting is a significant backlash. The Nobel laureate Wangari Maathai from Kenya, a very powerful woman, once said that the higher up you go in an institution, the fewer women you find. And if you think about the inverse, that the lower down you go, the more women you find, then I think what you realize is that you have women in very vulnerable positions, but you also have men in very powerful positions. And that this is not simply about institutional changes that need to be made. It's about personal changes that men have to make in the way they relate to women and the decisions that they make.
Well, Lauren, David mentioned that there was this urgent question of actual transformation beyond all the policy aspects of things. And what has the affiliates of ADUSA done in order to promote that sort of transformation to improve the working conditions for women?
You know, I think it's difficult because like David says, you've got to change the culture of the workplace. But for an example, as he mentioned with the mining sector not being transformed to take in women workers, you look at something like the transport industry where you've got train drivers who are female, but there's no toilets on the trains for them, which means previously men could just hop off the train and go and do their business wherever they need to, but women can't do that without sacrificing their human right to dignity. And it takes recognizing that men and women have different needs in society and changing the systems in which they work to make sure that the outcomes for both of them are of equal value.
You wanted to follow up there earlier.
Yes, I think that the situation with the mining industry is slightly different. As you go down, the racial nature of the labor structure changes, and you get more and more black people at the bottom of the pile. You get powerful women on the boards who are very politically connected and who are also shareholders. But when you go right down to the bottom, you get the mines sticking to the mining chart at 10% and 13%. So every morning when a shift of 100 workers go down the skip, you have for every 87 men, you've got 13 women. Okay, so the demographics is completely wrong in that particular situation. And so when women are crowded into the skips, the lifts that take them down, they are abused all the way down for 1,000 meters, all the way to where they get off into the tunnels and things like that. And the mines have not really transformed the working space underground or even above ground. When shifts change in the middle of the night, the mines work 24 hours out of 24 hours over a 3-shift period. And the men and women come off. The women have to stand outside the change rooms and wait for the men to wash and clean and whatever before they can go in, for example, because there's not appropriate facilities and so on created for women in those situations. And when you go underground and you have, for example, your rock drill operators and your mining teams underground, what usually happens is that men make transactions with women. Women are excluded from those job categories that can get big bonuses at the end of the month for the amount of rock and so on that they shift. And so the women are really at the basic salary, whereas men can have access to the bonuses. So the woman might get 4,500 rands a month, whereas the men can push up their income to 13,000, 14,000 rands a month with bonuses and so on if they're part of those teams. And so men offer to do certain jobs underground for the women because they perceive them to be weaker. Now, the people who operate mining have not thought about how to deploy women within that particular context. For example, they put them in large groups of men where the women are always a minority. You know, instead of saying, okay, let's put women as machine operators where they will not be surrounded by large groups of men, or let's put women as truck drivers, or let's put women as in more skilled categories of work. They just simply push them in with large teams of people doing the kinds of jobs where the men, because of the nature of mining and also the chauvinism of the sector, in fact, trade with the woman towards the end of the month to say, we'll share our bonuses with you if you give us sex. And so the managers and so on tell you that when you get to the last week before the month end, you have to walk carefully underground because you'll step on condoms. The shop stewards, the shaft stewards tell us in the mornings when the ore comes up on the conveyor belts, you will find it interspersed with condoms and things like that. You know, so it really is a nightmare because no one has thought about the sociology and the anthropology of the workplace arrangements that are there underground in South African mines.
And just a quick add in addition to that, I mean, clearly labour legislation, in particular health and safety legislation, prescribes facilities for workers, especially separate ones for men and women. But Sisonke, you've indicated you wanted to come in there. Please do.
Yeah, I think this is a really important set of comments that David has just made, because part of what's happening, I think, is that in the intermediate term, I think you do want to help mines to think about where they place women and men workers to ensure safety. In the long term, we're still going to get back to this issue of backlash, because I think particularly in sectors that are seen as preserves of a particular kind of masculinity, that you have to use your physical strength, all of these things have deeply embedded ideas of what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman. So what that means is that when a woman is in that situation, the sense of entitlement of her male colleagues is very high, and the sense that she is displacing, that 10%, that 13% allocated for women through the mining charter shouldn't actually be there. So what you're dealing with is a sense of deeply held entitlement that this job really shouldn't be yours. And what we see is that backlash, that bitterness often translates, whether consciously or unconsciously, into violence against women. And we see it in lots of different kinds of workplace, but I think it's particularly stark in the mining sector, which is why I think when we get to the case of Pinky, there are some real questions about why that case hasn't been dealt with. And I would like to believe that it's simply about inaction on the part of the police. But when I hear these kinds of textured, granular examples of what's really happening, and the understanding that there are condoms that are down there, that there's sort of systemic mistreatment of women bartering using sex, then I think there's a whole other set of questions that really need to be asked about what's happening and why there's inaction.
Could I, on that point, get to you, David, and tell us about the case of Pinky Moseane.
Well, what we suspect is that it was a sexual transaction gone wrong, where the male possibly refused to pay for the sex, and she threatened to report a rape case and then got killed as a result. But we don't know, because the mining corporation involved has gone silent on the issue. The authorities are silent on the issue. And, you know, we made, with Policy Gap 7, the last report that we made very specific recommendations to the Human Rights Commission and to the Department of Mineral Resources. And we've sent these through to the presidency and all the relevant ministers and the minister dealing with women, disability, and so on. And like with Policy Gap 1 that we did in 2007, initially there's an interest, and then it wanes and disappears. You know, initially people set up, then Marikana happened, and Pinky's case got lost in the mist of Marikana, and nothing has been done since then. Look, even in the cases where women apply for these 13% of jobs, the mines give the right to recruit labor to local chiefs and local councillors. And those councillors use their power to give these jobs for sex as well, and for trade in sex. We have recorded on video women speaking about the fact that they've been for interviews 3, 4, 5 times, and every time they were asked for sex, and when they refuse, they don't get the job.
Well, do you know, if I could follow up with you, Lauren, on that. I mean, is this the experience of Fedusa affiliates in the sector? Because I understand that there may be affiliates of Fedusa in the sector, and what are they saying should be done about this? I mean, we just heard David explain what has happened in Pinky's case and the suspicions we have there.
Well, I think, you know, it comes back to what I said earlier about people being vulnerable and not wanting to report their situations and needing the money to feed their families, and, you know, depending on their socioeconomic context. Obviously, from a union perspective, those women are encouraged, because we cannot strengthen that legislation and the Code of Good Practice on sexual harassment and that type of legislation without bringing cases to the fore. But, I mean, I think what we're realizing here as well is that this is a systemic problem. And we can write these policy reports and the unions can get involved, but when we take them to high-level institutions, it's not a priority. It can be there's an outcry when someone is raped. One in a huge number of women that are being raped. And we can take it to the presidency, we can take it to the Department for Women, but the truth of the matter is abuse against women is very low on the level of priorities.
We've got about a minute left. Sisonke, could I ask you, and we can continue this question perhaps afterwards, what do you think are the reasons for there being no arrest or a case in the courts to ensure justice for Pinky Mosiani and her family?
I think it's a complex set of reasons, but clearly there's a larger systemic issue. And as I said, I don't want to believe that there's a cover-up, but clearly if you put Pinky's case, it's a litmus test for how the entire mining sector is actually at the moment dealing with questions of women's participation, how it deals formally and informally with policy questions about women's participation in that sector more generally. So I think that's what the inaction is about. That if you look at that one rape case, what you're actually revealing is a whole other set of layered transactions and interactions between with people knowing what's happening and deciding for whatever reasons not to act.
Well, thanks for that, and we'll be back in a moment. Now over to Julian Nkwazi with the Labour News.
In South African Labour News, South Africa's unemployment rate has slightly decreased in the second quarter to 25.6% from 25.2% in the first. Statistics South Africa said there was a gain of 100,000 in employment in the quarter, although this was quite an offset by an additional 122,000 people looking for jobs. This meant about 4.7 million people were unemployed in the second quarter. Nedbank economist Johannes Koza said it is not a surprise that we are seeing an increase in the unemployment rate given the current economic environment. National Union of Mine Workers General Secretary Franz Baleni has dismissed claims that he planted the women who accused Zwelinzima Vavi of rape. He is associated with a powerful faction in COSATU unhappy with General Secretary Vavi's repeated criticism of government and the ANC. Vavi further made it known that the rape complainant had withdrawn her grievance against him just 2 hours into the internal COSATU process set up to investigate the matter. Meanwhile, the ANC Women's League expressed concern about the sexual harassment complaint against COSATU's General Secretary Zwelinzima Vavi having been withdrawn. ANCWL Deputy President Nosipa Ntwanambi said the withdrawal of the complainant is worrying and disconcerting. She says they are extremely concerned that this case will result in an immense setback for our national fight against the rape epidemic in our country and the persistent harassment of women in the workplace. Secondly, it was our view that COSATU could not offer the comprehensive protection, support and assistance to the complainant as it would be the case within the legal system. Now, if you want to be part of our program tonight, please send your opinions and suggestions to our Facebook page, which is the Workers' World Facebook page, and then a message to 083 233 8556. Or why not a tweet at WWMP_Labour Show, or an email to ctvlaborshow@wwmp.org.za. Now, in a moment, Ashraf will be asking why is it that the unions like NUM and its federation has not done anything about Pinky Mosiani's case. And now, time to thank the people who make this program possible with part sponsorship and support. But first, our station identification.
You are watching Cape Town Television as we present this week's edition of Workers' World. Workers' World is brought to you in part by the FNV, the Dutch Trade Union Federation, EED Protestant Development Service. Also sponsored in part by the Department of Labour and the Olive Palm Centre, a Swedish NGO with international human rights and democracy, who kindly supplied support and funding for this series.
am young, I am African, and I am free. Pictures surround me, influence me, and expose me.
Ngikhulile, ulwazi isikhali sami, ngiwumvikeli.
You are my teacher and my mentor. You clear the path before me. You guide my choices so that I know what my freedom means.
Ngibona umhlaba nezilingo zawo.
Recognizing danger, I defend myself and those that I love.
As I grow, I look to you. I seek your advice and your approval. You teach me to understand what you have experienced, and that makes me stronger.
Ngingumholi wekusasa lethu, uMalusi. Ukwazi ukuthi uphephile kwenza ngiqine idolo.
I want to see all the things that the world has to offer me. Movies.
Games.
I want to read. Connect to media.
At home.
At the movies.
With my friends.
I learn to take responsibility for myself.
We share that responsibility as you grow.
I watch, I play. I take in the words and the pictures that surround me.
I watch and guard you, keeping you safe.
My choice is informed by your choice.
And the right choice will protect you.
And set us free.
We inform, you choose.
You're watching Workers' World here on Cape Town TV, and it's the 60-minute edition. The question we are discussing is gender-based abuse and violence at the workplace. We ask the pertinent question, what are trade unions doing about this? Our guest on the show to discuss this particular topic is David van Wyk, the lead researcher at Benchmark Foundation, Sisonke Msimang, a senior program specialist at Sonke Gender Justice, and Lauren Upping from the Federation of Unions of South Africa, FEDUSA. David, if I could just get back to you on our first question with regard to, well, the question that sort of flows from the previous segment, as well as the question of what the role of the Union Federation is. What are the reasons why there's been no arrest or case against the courts to ensure justice for Pinky Mosiani and her family?
Well, I think it has to do with power relations in the mining sector. I think that a lot of mining corporations are able to skirt the law because they've got very powerful politicians on their boards and in their shareholding structures. Let me be brutally frank about that. Since the time of Cecil John Rhodes, there has been this nefarious political influence on this particular industry. You will remember that Rhodes was the first Prime Minister of the Cape, but also the owner of De Beers Mining Company, and he used that position, that political position of his, to abuse the industry that he was in. And since then, every government in South Africa basically has been affected. You know, so mines get away with murder in South Africa. You know, this is the problem that is there, and they get away with murder because they are so politically powerful and they're so politically connected.
Well, at this point, I think it's important just to inform our viewers that the producers of the show did invite the National Union of Mine Workers to participate in this discussion. The NUM declined to join our panel on this particular topic. We hope that sometime in the future we may get their clear position on this. If I could follow up on that, David has given us a sense. Sisonke, you indicated earlier that you think some of the reasons are linked to, I think, not necessarily a cover-up, but the systemic issues. Are those the only reasons? Aren't there actors in the situation that is not necessarily bound by systemic hurdles and problems?
Sure, and I think the key actor that we'd have to ask questions about there are the police. So I think we're all well aware that our justice system in South Africa often works slowly, if at all, particularly for women, and particularly for issues of gender-based violence. So I think there are a number of questions that need to be asked of the police. 1 in 9 women report rape at all in South Africa. So of every 9 times something happens, only 1 woman goes to the police to actually report it, and that's for a reason, let alone now when the victim is actually dead, right? So the sense of the family that anything is actually going to get done, the fact that often we're talking about communities, certainly in Pinky's case, where you've got a mother who doesn't have a lot of economic resources herself to be chasing around issues. So you have to think about what it means to report a case and then follow it up. And I think often many families in South Africa end up being exhausted by the justice system and exhausted with having to chase the police to get them to do their job. So there's a whole other set of systemic issues on top of what is happening in the mining sector itself.
Well, Lauren, what do you think should now be done, actually as a matter of urgency, given that 18 months ago this death and this murder has taken place in the ground? What is the urgent thing to do now?
Well, I think, we see this massive discrimination in our courts and justice system, where when it's a high-profile figure, we suddenly all glued to our TV screens. We demand justice. We want to see, and also very often when it's a public figure, we tend to take their side regardless. And the woman that has been raped or violently assaulted, we tend to see them as an anonymous person, a victim of this crime. And I think we need to really put pressure on our justice system and the SAPS to bring this case to the forefront. I think we see even with our ministers and the presidency, in a case like Oscar Pistorius, everyone's there, demanding that the scourge of violence in this country is dealt with, but then it peters off. And I think this case is just one example, and a very pertinent example to the trade union movement, where we need to say something needs to be done. We need to see this case being brought to the courts. We need to see action.
Well, David, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, I just want to come in there. We've got a network of monitors throughout mine communities as the Benchmarks Foundation, who monitor and report back to us. And on Human Rights Day this year, one of our female monitors was beaten up by the police for taking pictures of a mine. And, when you speak to our monitors about the police, they say the police are useless because the police belong to the mines in the Rustenburg area. They blatantly say that the police operate like the private security of mining companies.
I think that's a really good point. In fact, having done some work in the DRC over the last 4 years, we find that's absolutely the case. So in countries where there's even less rule of law, the police are often actually in the pocket of the mining companies, and they do treat them like a private security force. So I think the collusion between the state and between the private sector in this country is something we're very well aware of, and it's increasing in its sort of urgency to deal with it. But I also want to reflect on this other point that Lauren's making about the role of the media. One of the things in the Pinky Moisane case is that actually a number of senior editors of big South African newspapers have been repeatedly contacted to run stories on her case. And repeatedly, those emails have gone unanswered, unread, unaddressed. So I do think it comes back down to the fact that there are flavors of the moment about the kinds of cases that are important, and those flavors only become important because people make them important. So I think a few years ago we had never heard of this so-called term corrective rape, and the mobilization of gay, lesbian, bisexual and transgender people in this country has made it impossible to ignore, and I think we need to start thinking about doing the same thing around the lives of primarily African women that actually don't matter to many people in our country.
Well, just follow up quickly on the role of the mainstream media in preparation for the show. I found it very distressing not to find a single article in the mainstream media other than, I think, one particular media house. Otherwise, it was all sort of alternative media. And then quite clearly, I think that the last point you make, Sisonke, is about who is the constituency then that we need to mobilize? David, could I come to the question about, again, the trade unions involved in that particular mine and the federations they belong to. It appears that they're not doing anything regarding the Pinky Moisane case, and we've asked the Mine Workers Union to be on this show. Unfortunately, they've declined. Were they extremely vocal and willing to campaign? Well, the only thing I found was on the International Federation's website an indication that the Mine Workers Union was asked to run some sort of, I think, pink or white ribbon campaign.
Well, I think that the problem in the Rustenburg area is, of course, the rivalry between AMCU and the NUM. And so this case has fallen between the cracks because of that. In the meantime, NUM has lost control of the Platinum Belt effectively. We work there on a day-to-day basis, and we've done so for the last 5, 6, 7 years. Whereas NUM was a very prominent union in that area a year and a half ago, now its presence is extremely limited. Because of the shift that has taken place in that particular area. But then again, if we look at the new union coming in as well, it's a very male-dominated union, like NUM was. You know, there are female representatives, and there are female workers who are members of both of these unions on the mines and so on. But the problem is that women's issues disappear in worker struggles unless they are prominently pushed.
And I think that the people who used to push those was the women's movement in South Africa. So I think we find ourselves at a very, I want to say, depressing moment in our country at the moment. So I think your question is, who's the constituency? And the constituency is clearly not the unions, with respect, right? I think it's clearly not the unions because they've failed to do anything thus far, precisely for this issue, which is that women's issues become invisible because there's a larger worker struggle, but also because the unions are facing their own disarray, because the sector is declining, because of mechanization. There's a whole range of very complicated issues that are happening. But what that means is that you then need even more the women's movement to come in strongly. The only reason that unions and other sectors in society have ever dealt with women's issues is because you've had a strong and vibrant movement of women pushing the issue. At this moment in time, we don't have that. It's been defunded. Many women's rights leaders have gone into the state and taken up very key and important positions in the state, but that means their allegiance is now to the state. And you need an active, vibrant civil society led by women who are going to push the agenda. And that's part of the problem here.
Well, just a quick follow-up. I mean, your mandate as Sonke Gender Justice is to address directly the men and boys. I mean, don't you see the mine workers, although dominated by mainly men on the mines, as an important challenge to address as well?
Absolutely. So I think part of what we've always said is that Sonke Gender Justice holds itself as accountable to the women's movement, working to ensure that men transform themselves in order to engage in an appropriate way with the women's movement. One of the biggest challenges we find as an organization is that the women's sector that's supposed to hold us accountable actually isn't as fully functional as it once was. So I think there's two things that need to get done. The first thing that needs to get done is that we need to look at the way that men work within highly male-dominated sectors and institutions, and begin to roll out programs that seek to tackle masculinities. On the other hand, we need to work with women in those spaces to support them, and with a wider movement of civil society and social justice organizations to make sure that women's rights are recognized and fully empowered. It's not going to happen if you don't have both, and at the moment I think we're struggling with both.
Lauren, yes, please, you want to follow up there?
You know, I know you said it shouldn't lie with the union, and maybe we're seeing a silence on behalf of NUM in this case and COSATU. But you know, the federations have just signed this mining framework agreement for peace in the mining sector, and it's completely gender blind. There's not a single reference to women in the mining sector and the violence that might be taking place there. And from the stories we've heard from David, there clearly is much violence towards women in this sector. Now, how can they sign a peace agreement under the, and being brought together by the deputy president, which doesn't refer to any of those issues? And again, it talks to how these issues are just enveloped under the workers' struggle. And when there's other key issues like the rivalry between AMCU and NUM, we see that those issues of women are absolutely become invisible. So I think the federations actually do have a responsibility there to go beyond, federation lines and say this is an issue that is happening in one of our major sectors. What are we going to do about it?
A quick question, Lauren. Which of Fedusa's affiliates are in that particular mine in the Platinum Belt?
Fedusa, UASA, the union,
that's involved there.
And has obviously been part of that framework agreement too.
So my sense, it's National Youth Mine Workers, it's AMCU, it's UASA, and in some cases Solidarity.
Yes.
Am I correct?
Solidarity, and you would find a little bit of NUMSA as well.
A bit of NUMSA as well, in the platinum sector.
That's right. Well, mining sector generally. But look, there's another issue that yes, I think we should also pay attention to, and the international agencies on migration and so on have found this. And this particular issue relates to the fact that people are smuggling in young women into informal settlements, and then they actually sell them as sex slaves to mine workers. Okay, we found Mozambican woman, 15, 16 years old, being brought across without any papers and so on, and then the mine worker supplements his income by selling that person's as a sex worker to other mine workers when they're not on shift. We also find that a woman gets smuggled in from Lesotho. They don't have any papers, they don't speak the local language, they can't engage with people. Another factor which we think is very, very important is regarding migrant labor. The literacy levels in our mines consistently remains at a literacy level of 60%, meaning 40% of the workers on the mine don't read or write. So whatever programs you do, whatever notices you put up, these guys can't even read. Many of them, I met a machine operator just last week in one of the informal settlements who comes from Mozambique. He can't even speak English, but he's been a machine operator in one of the mines near Rustenburg in Ikemeleng village for the last 15 years. Now, all the notices are in English and Afrikaans. He can't read, he can't speak English or Afrikaans. How are you going to get the message across to these people? It is interesting that in other countries where they don't use migrant workers in mines, you actually don't have the same kind of problems. And you have much higher levels of literacy as well. Now, when we had the liberation struggle in this country, one of the cornerstones of that struggle was an end to the migrant labor system and building family accommodation for workers in the areas where they are working and so on. And none of that has materialized because the mining industry is so politically powerful in this country that it has prevented that from happening.
Well, that's an excellent point. To follow up on that, Sisonke, I need to come up with the next question.
I think that's an important point. You know, a lot of the work that we do at Sonke is around HIV/AIDS. And there was a study done in the early 90s that talked about the fact that domestic workers, in particular in South Africa, if you look at a lot of our messages around behavior change, what wasn't working was the fact that domestic workers live in very isolated environments, which means that the social sanction for sexual behavior is very different than if you're sitting in a community. If you continue to live in your township and then go to work for your employer on a daily basis and then come home, the opportunities both for sexual violence but also for a whole range of other sexual experiences isn't there. And I think that part of what's at play with the migrant labor system is that in addition to the entitlement I spoke of earlier, you also have a male entitlement to sex, regardless of how it happens. And I think we also have to begin to tackle that head on. And you have less social censure for violence and for all kinds of appalling behavior because you're not in your community.
Sisonke, we're in the last minute. Could we get first perhaps from you, Lauren, what is the key thing that needs to be done now about Pinky's case and the social crisis regarding violence and abuse in 2 or 3 sentences, Lauren?
I think from my perspective, I think it's talking to that idea of the gap in the women's movement, and it's about bringing and empowering women activists in the union movement. I really believe there is a gap between the original women's struggle and the women's movement and the younger generation. There isn't that activism and that sense of demanding equality for women within, between the older and the younger women.
Would you then argue raising awareness around these key issues?
Absolutely, but educating those women on their rights and empowering them to be negotiators at the collective bargaining table.
2 or 3 sentences. I know that's a challenge, but 2 or 3 sentences.
We often say at Sonke that gender equality is not about getting men to wash dishes. Gender equality is about recognizing that if the man decides not to wash the dishes, a woman is going to hold him accountable and force a conversation. So for me, I think what needs to happen is that men need to wash dishes and women need to force them to wash the dishes, both sides.
Perhaps we should start when we are young and ensure that the boys and the girls both do it at the same time. David, I'm not sure if you've taken some of your time, but 2 or 3 sentences, what are the key things?
Well, Marikana provided us with a golden opportunity to investigate mining as a whole. Instead, the president said, let's investigate 1 week of violence. And all the other violence gets hidden by that 1 week of violence. There was an opportunity there for this government to clean up this industry. It didn't take it.
David, thank you for that. While we've been on air tonight, Jurina Nkwazi has been monitoring the social media feedback wrap. Over to you, Jurina.
What a touchy subject we have here tonight. One of our comments read as follows: "We are being silenced as women at the moment. The moment we raise our voices, it is kind of sad that our unions are not making a noise about our issues, but instead non-profit organizations are prepared to do so." Another one says, "Fear remains an issue." But I would like to highlight an article which was published recently on www.womeninandbeyond.org. The title was "Pinky Musiana Should Have Known Better." But I would like to highlight a comment from the union apparently saying, the union told Pinky Musiani, "Pinky, please let us bury you. Stop screaming from the grave. This is North Country, baby. You should have known better, underground, overground," which kind of stir up some kind of emotion. If you have any reactions or opinions or suggestions about this particular article or regarding why nothing has been said or still not done about this incident, please send us an SMS to 083-233-8556 or post us a comment on our Facebook page to the Workers' World Labour Show. Why not a tweet at WWMP_Labour Show or an email to ctvlaborshow@wwmp.org.za.
And this is where we again ask this critical question our show addressed tonight. Where is justice for the Anglo Platinum's murdered female underground mine worker, Pinky Musiani? And at this point, I want to say thank you very much to our guest. And that's David van Wyk, lead researcher at Benchmark Foundation. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you, Ashraf.
And Sisonke Msimang, Senior Program Specialist at Sonke Gender Justice. Thank you very much for your contributions. And Lauren Upping from the Federation of Union South Africa, FEDUSA. Lauren, thanks for your contributions to this particular topic. I'm sure we would have loved to have had more time to conclude on some of the additional issues. And that's where we conclude our discussion this week on gender-based abuse and violence at the workplace, more particularly the rape and murder of Pinky Musiani at Anglo Platinum's mine about 18 months ago. Now, we've heard our guests speak about the need to change the culture, the fundamental culture at the workplace that creates the power dynamics and the gender inequality that pertains there. We've also had our panel indicate that clearly the employers, those who basically own the mines and who control that space and that environment, has not applied their minds clearly in ensuring that the introduction of 10 to 13% women workers on the lower levels of the workforce is done in a way that ensures a safe and a healthy workplace for all workers, particularly those who are female workers. And we've heard horrific stories about the practices underground and the favors that male workers require female workers to provide when they assist them, especially when they have the very basic salary they earn and not being able to earn any bonuses. But our panel has indicated this is a much complex matter, and a matter that doesn't just affect us in the workplace, but as society as a whole. And I think we are pretty unclear about what the role of the authorities are in this situation. What I do know is that the employer, in terms of legislation applicable to the mining sector, should be investigating incidents like this, incidents of workplace violence, incidents of abuse, rape and murder within the workplace. We found 18 months later, there's been no case and there's been no justice for Pinky Musiani. We want you, the viewers, to raise your voices to ensure that this does not happen again. And that's where we can conclude this week's discussion. Remember, a working class united will never be defeated. From all of us here at Workers' World, goodbye until next time.
From England to Poland, every step across the ocean, the ruling classes, them is in a mess. Oh yes, the capitalist system a regress, but the Soviet system now progress. So which one of them you think is best? When are the two of them the workers a contest? When crisis is the order of the day, when so much people crying out for change nowadays. So what about the working class, Comrade Chairman? What about the working class? They bear the cost. they carry the cross. And them now go forget them tongues in Gadangs. Them now go forget them tongues. From the east to the west, to the land I love the best. The ruling classes, them is in a mess. Oh yes, crisis is the order of the day. The workers, them demanding more pay every day. The peasants want a lot more say nowadays. The youth, them rebelling everywhere. Everywhere, insurrection is the order of the day. There's a lot of people crying out for change nowadays. Nobody blame it on the black working class, Mr. Ray.